In Wyoming in 1887, a man could lose everything with a piece of paper.
She had spent 6 months keeping his ranch alive, one seam at a time. She did not know he was coming.
He had bought the paper for pennies. He had come to collect the land. 30 days, $312. Or he takes the land.
The train came in 20 minutes late, the way trains did in the spring of 1887 when the snowmelt off the mountains turned the lower grades to soft ground and the locomotives had to ease their way through like old men, picking a path across ice. Raymond Aldis stood on the depot platform at Sweetwater Crossing with his hat in both hands and the wind pulling at the brim, and he watched the engine come around the long bend south of town, trailing its plume of gray smoke against a sky the color of worn denim. He was 34 years old, and he had not slept well the night before. The platform filled around him the way platforms did when a train came in. The station master with his clipboard, a boy sent to collect a package, 2 women waiting for a relation, a drummer in a city coat already scanning the crowd for anyone who looked like they might need what he was selling. Raymond stood apart from all of it and turned his hat in his hands and tried to recall the exact words of the last letter, the one that had decided him. She had written in a fine, even hand. He had read the letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She was 29 years old. She had nursed a sick mother for 9 years until the woman passed. She knew how to work and did not fear it. She had not said she was pretty, and she had not said she was gentle, and those omissions had troubled him some when he first read them. But he had come around to thinking they were honest omissions, and honesty was rarer than pretty in his experience. She had said she could sew anything that could be sewn. He had read that line and thought of the cabin windows with their bare frames, and the shirts piled in the corner with their elbows gone through, and the pair of curtains he had been meaning to hang for 2 years, the fabric still folded in brown paper on the shelf where he had left it. The train doors opened. Passengers came down the iron steps in the order that passengers always did. The men first, confident of their footing, then the families with children held by the hand, then the slower ones, the old and the careful. Raymond watched each face as it came and found in each one the wrong face, and the waiting pulled at him the way waiting always did, tightening something behind his sternum. And then she came down. She was tall. She wore a brown traveling dress that had gone soft at the seams from long use, and she carried a carpet bag in her left hand, and in her right hand she carried something he had not expected, a long wooden box, narrow, perhaps 3 feet in length, with a leather strap wrapped twice around it and buckled tight. She carried it with the care of someone transporting something that mattered, not something fragile exactly, but something valued. She stepped onto the platform and her eyes moved across it the way a person reads a page, steadily taking in each thing in its proper order, not hurrying past anything, not lingering either. She took in the station master and the drummer and the 2 waiting women, and she took in Raymond, and when her eyes reached him, they stopped. She crossed the platform and set the wooden box down at her feet with the same care she had carried it, and she put out her right hand. "Mr. Aldis," she said. "I'm Cecilia. I'd like to see the place before I decide anything." He had been about to say something welcoming. He could not afterward remember what. He took her hand instead. Her grip was firm and her palm had the roughness of someone who worked with their hands. And he said, "Train was late. We'll lose an hour of light." "Then we'd better go," she said, and picked up the wooden box. He had brought the wagon. It was not the best wagon he owned, but it was the most honest, the board scrubbed, the harness checked that morning, the team groomed. He helped her up to the seat, though she did not seem to require the help, and he loaded her carpet bag behind the seat and then stood for a moment looking at the wooden box in her hands. "I can put that in the back," he said. "I'll keep it here," she said. They rode south out of town with the late afternoon light coming long across the sage flats, and Raymond talked the way a man talks when he is nervous, and trying not to show it, steadily about nothing of great consequence, the condition of the road, the late spring, the price of beef at the last sale. Cecilia listened and looked out at the country and asked after a time one question. "How many head are you running?" 60, he said. "Cattle. String of horses besides." She nodded as though this confirmed something she had already calculated, and went back to looking at the country. The Aldis ranch came into view as the sun touched the ridge west of the valley, the light going gold and then amber across the grass. Raymond watched her face as the buildings came visible, the cabin, the barn leaning slightly to the east where the foundation had settled, the corral with its sagging fence, the scatter of wagons and gear in the yard. He had cleaned the yard that week, or tried to, but there was only so much cleaning a man alone could do, and the truth of the place was visible in the slant of the barn and the gap in the corral and the want covers draped over the gear like gray wings, split and patched and split again. He waited for her face to do what faces did. The doubt coming in, the quick reassessment, the smile that was not quite a smile. Her face did not do those things. She studied the ranch the way she had studied the depot platform, steadily, taking each thing in. The barn, the corral, the wagons, the cabin with its bare windows. When the wagon stopped, she climbed down before he could hand her off the seat, and she stood in the yard and turned a slow full circle, and he could not read what the circle meant. Then she walked to the nearest wagon parked beside the barn. It was the grain wagon, and its canvas cover was the worst on the place, split along the center seam, the edges pulling away from the stitching in long gray fringes where the rot had worked through over 2 wet seasons. Cecilia put her hand flat against it. She worked 2 fingers into the main split and widened it, not roughly, but with the deliberate pressure of someone examining a wound, and she looked at the weave and the rot and the places where the old patches had pulled free from stitching that had never been heavy enough for the work it was asked to do. "How long has this been like this?" she asked. 2 seasons, near enough, Raymond said. "Maybe 3. She made a small sound that was not quite anything he could name and stepped back and looked at the whole yard. The wagon, the barn, the gear stacked along the barn wall under coverings in similar condition, the saddle on the fence rail with its skirt hanging by 3 threads. Her gaze moved across it all with the same quality of attention, calm and exact, and Raymond felt under that attention something he was not accustomed to feeling on his own land. He felt seen, and the seeing was not comfortable because what was being seen was not only the ranch. "Mr. Aldis," she said, not unkindly, "this whole yard is bleeding money through holes nobody's mending." He took his hat off and turned it in his hands. "I've been meaning to get to it." "I know," she said. "Men always mean to get to it." She said it without heat. She was already turning toward the cabin. "Show me the house." The cabin was 2 rooms, and he had swept it twice that week and moved the pile of shirts to the bedroom where they would not be immediately visible, and put the folded curtain fabric on the kitchen table where it could be seen and understood as intention. Cecilia moved through the 2 rooms in a few minutes, opening the door to the bedroom, looking at the plank floor, running her hand along the window frame where the cold came in all winter because there was nothing at the glass to stop it. She looked at the curtain fabric on the table. "Blue gingham," she said. "I picked it out myself," Raymond said. 2 years ago, near enough." She looked at it a moment longer, and then she set the wooden box on the kitchen table, next to the curtain fabric, and she unbuckled the leather strap and opened it. He had expected, he was not certain what he had expected, something a woman might carry. Thread and needles of the domestic sort, a thimble, perhaps a small hoop. What he saw instead was a kit unlike anything he had encountered outside of a ship chandler's catalog, and he had only seen such a catalog once, years ago, in the hands of a man who had come west from the coast and still talked about the sea the way other men talked about women they had loved and lost. The box held needles of a size he had not thought needles came in, curved like small scythes, some straight as wire and heavy enough to punch through layered canvas without bending. It held an awl with a wooden handle worn smooth by long use, and beside it a second awl, finer, for lighter work. There were spools of waxed linen thread in 2 weights, a lump of something pale and waxy that was beeswax and tallow melted together, 2 palm guards of shaped leather with the thimble bosses set in at the heel of the hand where the needle would press in the pushing, and shears, 2 pairs, one heavy enough to cut doubled canvas, one fine enough for detail work, both sharp by the look of the edges. The box was worn at the corners from years of travel, and the interior was fitted with small wooden dividers so that each tool had its place and stayed in it when the box was moved. Raymond looked at this kit for a long moment. "My father," Cecilia said, "was a sailmaker in Boston before he went inland and married my mother. He built and mended the canvas that drove ships across oceans. Mainsails, staysails, tarpaulins, sea bags, everything a ship needs to keep the wind and weather out and the cargo in. He taught me this work before I could properly read. When he died, he left me his tools." She set her hand flat on the open box. "Curtains I can make in an afternoon, Mr. Aldis, and they'll be pretty. They'll keep out the light and nothing else that matters. But that wagon cover outside is the difference between dry grain at the end of a wet week and a ton of rotted oats. Those saddle skirts are one hard ride from failing entirely. That tent I saw behind the barn, the one your men use on the far grass in summer, it's been repaired so many times with the wrong thread that the repairs are weaker than the original cloth." She closed the box. "I can sew curtains," she said. "I would rather sew the things that keep this place alive." The sun was off the windows and the cabin was going dim, and Raymond Aldis stood across his own kitchen table from this woman and understood that he had written to St. Louis for one thing and been sent something else entirely, and that the question before him was not whether she was what he had asked for. She clearly was not, but whether what she actually was might be something the ranch needed more than what he had asked for. It was not an easy thing for a man of 34 who had built this place out of nothing and silence and stubbornness to conclude. His nearest neighbor, a man named Pruitt who ran cattle on the north end of the valley and had been married 20 years to a woman who kept an immaculate house and an excellent kitchen garden, had said to him once that a wife's worth wasn't in what she promised but in what she fixed when nobody was looking. Raymond had thought he understood what Pruitt meant. He was beginning to think he had not understood it at all. Folks'll talk, he said. It was not an argument exactly. It was the last objection he had, and he put it forward honestly. Folks talk whether you give them cause or not, Cecilia said. I found it's cheaper to give them no money and let them talk than to give them money and have them praise you. He almost smiled. Almost. The house, he said. It still wants keeping. And I'll keep it, she said. I'll cook and I'll clean and I'll mend your shirts, and you won't go ragged. But I won't sit idle by a window with a hoop in my lap while everything outside it falls to pieces. She looked at him directly. That's not the woman who wrote you those letters. If you wanted that woman, you'd best say so now, and I'll go back on tomorrow's train, and we'll both call it an honest mistake. Outside, the last light went off the ridge, and the yard fell into blue shadow. Raymond could hear Orin Gale moving around in the bunkhouse. The older man was careful about his supper routine and did not vary it, and somewhere out past the corral Tad Spur was talking to one of the horses in the aimless way the boy did when he thought no one could hear. Raymond thought about the long empty cabin and the sound of his own boots on the plank floor at night. He thought about the rot working through his gear faster than his cattle could earn against it. He thought about the curtain fabric sitting on the table for 2 years. Stay, he said. We'll see how it sits. Cecilia closed the wooden box and buckled the strap. It'll sit fine, she said. Show me where the worst of it is. They were married on Saturday by the circuit preacher in town, with a rancher named Pruitt and his wife for witnesses. It was a brief ceremony, more practical than ceremonial, and afterward Raymond went to get the wagon while Cecilia went into the mercantile. When he brought the wagon around, she was already coming out. Not with ribbon or thread or any of the domestic goods he might have expected a new bride to buy, but with 8 yards of heavy duck canvas rolled under one arm and 4 spools of waxed linen thread in her other hand. And she was counting the last of her own coins onto the storekeeper's palm while the storekeeper watched with a look on his face like a man who has just seen something he does not have a category for. The storekeeper's name was Harlon Voss. He was a narrow man somewhere in his middle 50s with the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to calculating the value of things at a glance. He had run the Sweetwater Crossing mercantile for 20 years, and he ran it with the confidence of a man who has no competition within 40 miles and knows it. He sold canvas and harness and grain sacks and rope and 100 other necessities of ranch life, and he sold them at prices that reflected his position as the only man for 40 miles who had them. He watched Cecilia load the canvas into the wagon and said nothing. But something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, but the near relation of one, the expression of a man who has noted something and filed it away for later use. Back at the ranch that evening, Cecilia did not unpack her dresses first. She unpacked the sailmaker's box and set it on the kitchen table and sharpened her shears against a whetstone she produced from the carpet bag, drawing each blade carefully and testing the edge against her thumb until it satisfied her. Then she put on an apron. She had 2, both plain and sturdy, and she made supper, and she made it well enough that Raymond ate without thinking about it, which was more than he could say for his own cooking. After supper, she went back to the wooden box. Orin Gale was the first to form an opinion, and he formed it before breakfast the next morning when he came out of the bunkhouse and found Cecilia in the barn with the grain wagon's canvas spread across the swept floor, on her hands and knees going over every inch of it with a stub of chalk in her hand, marking the rot and the strain points and the places where the old patches had pulled free. She marked each one with a small, careful X and moved on to the next without looking up. Orin stood in the barn doorway for a long moment with his arms folded and his opinion visible on his face the way weather is visible in the sky before it arrives. He was 51 years old and had been working cattle ranches in Wyoming since before Raymond Aldis had come west, and he had his own clear and settled ideas about how a ranch was run and what each person on it ought to be doing. He did not say anything. He unfolded his arms after a time and went to see about the horses, but he did not unfold his face. Tad Spur was less restrained. Tad was 19 and had not yet acquired the habit of keeping his thoughts from becoming words, which was in some ways a disadvantage and in some ways simply honest. He came into the barn mid-morning while Cecilia was stitching the first repair on the grain cover, a long split near the center seam that she had cut clean and was now closing with a flat felled seam, the kind that lay smooth and shed water rather than collecting it at a ridge, and he stood watching her with his hat in his hand and his feelings plain. "I've never seen a man's work done by a woman on her knees in a barn," he said. "It doesn't seem fitting." Cecilia did not look up from her seam. "Hand me that awl by your boot," she said, "and you'll have done a fitting thing yourself." Tad looked down. The awl was indeed by his boot. He picked it up and held it out, and Cecilia took it without looking up and used it to open a stitch she wasn't satisfied with, pulling the thread free and reworking the section. Tad watched this. He had quick eyes and the natural curiosity of a young man who is genuinely interested in how things work, and whatever his feelings about the propriety of the situation, the work itself began to draw his attention. He stayed to watch. By noon, he was holding the far edge of the canvas taut while she stitched, because she had asked him to without explaining why, and he had done it without quite meaning to. By the end of that first week, he could close a torn edge with a whip stitch well enough that it held, though not so neatly as hers. He wore the small skill with the pride of someone who has learned something useful in spite of himself. The canvas work took 7 days, the grain cover rebuilt, 2 smaller covers patched and reseamed, the rot cut entirely away in 3 places, and new ducks set in with lapping edges so the rain would run off clean. Each seam Cecilia waxed as she went, drawing the thread through the beeswax and tallow block before each pass so the stitches sealed themselves as she pulled them tight. It was slow work done properly, but it was not slow work done poorly, and there was a difference. On the 7th day, a hard spring rain came down the valley. Raymond was up before light, which was his habit, and he went to the barn in the dark with a lantern to check the horses, and on his way back he stopped at the grain wagon and stood looking at the canvas cover in the lantern light. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of rain that found every weakness in a cover and exploited it, the kind of rain that had soaked his oats 3 times in the past 2 years and left him counting the loss against a season already running thin. He pulled back the edge of the canvas and put his hand in. The grain was dry, not surface dry in the way that grain can be dry on top and wet 6 inches down, dry to the bottom, dry at the side closest to the center seam that had been the worst of the rot. He pushed his arm into the elbow, and the grain was dry there too, dry and cool and running through his fingers the way good dry grain does, without the slight cling of moisture that means trouble is coming. He stood with his arm in the dry grain for a long moment, rain running off his hat, lantern throwing its circle of yellow light across the wagon and the repaired cover in the dark yard beyond. He came in to breakfast without saying anything about it. But he ate 2 full helpings, and he looked at his wife twice while he ate, and the second time he looked at her there was something in his face that had not been there before. Not gratitude exactly, and not surprise exactly, but something in the neighborhood of both that did not yet have a name. Cecilia refilled his coffee and did not make anything of the 2 helpings or the looking. After breakfast she went back to the barn, and the next thing on her list, which was the saddle gear. A Western stock saddle is a construction of wood and leather and stitching, and on the Aldis ranch most of that stitching had been losing its argument with weather and hard use for several seasons. The saddle skirts had torn loose from the bars where sweat and years had rotted the original thread. The cinches were frayed to their last useful threads. The latigos had cracked along their length, the leather gone hard and checked. She could not do the leather work of a trained saddler. She did not have the proper stands or the punching tools for heavy leather work, but she could stitch, and stitching was 3/4 of what the gear needed. She bought a saddler's awl and a roll of harness thread, and she restitched the skirts to the trees, doubling the failing sections with new stitching set inside the old. She reinforced the cinches with new webbing stitched through and through. A new cinch from Harlon Voss's store cost $2.50. She made each failing one serve another season for the cost of thread and time. She kept account of it in the ledger she had bought at the mercantile on her first trip to town, a small book with marbled covers and clean pages. On the left side of each page she wrote what a thing would have cost to replace, new from Voss or from the saddler in Casper, which was 40 miles north and required a full day's travel each way. On the right side she wrote what it had cost her in thread and canvas and time to mend. The column on the right was so much shorter than the column on the left that the first time Raymond read it, standing behind her chair one evening while she worked the figures, he said, "You've made a mistake somewhere." She had not made a mistake. He read it again and said nothing, but he sat down across from her and watched her work the next line of figures into the ledger with the same calm attention she brought to everything. And he had the feeling of a man who has been wrong about something important enough, that the wrongness has been carrying a cost he was not aware of until someone showed him the ledger. Word of the sailmaker's wife did get around the Sweetwater Valley exactly as Raymond had feared it would, but it did not travel the way he had expected. It started, as most true things do, with something small and specific. Nora Crane came calling the second week. She was a widow in her late 50s who ran 40 hens in a Keene mine 3 miles up the creek, and she arrived with a basket of eggs in the direct manner of a woman who has outlived whatever social hesitancy she might once have possessed. She found Cecilia in the yard restitching a saddle's torn skirt and looked at her for a long moment with the frank assessment of someone taking a measurement. "So you're the one," Nora said. "That won't sew curtains." "I'll sew yours," Cecilia said, "if you've a window wants dressing." Nora laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Lord, no. I want to know if you can fix a grain sack. I lose half a bushel a season through mouse holes, and I'm too old to chase the mice." "Bring them," Cecilia said. "I'll show you." Nora brought 17 grain sacks the following week, and Cecilia sat at the kitchen table 3 evenings in a row and closed the mouse holes in the worn-through corners with a tight, even stitch, and the sacks that would have been discarded held grain again. She charged Nora nothing for the first batch, because Nora was a neighbor and because the work was simple. But she showed Nora the stitch and left her with enough waxed thread to do the next batch herself if she had the patience for it. Nora Crane, as it turned out, had both patience and a wide acquaintance, and she carried the news of what she had seen at the Aldis ranch the way a woman with 40 years in a valley carries news, accurately, specifically, and to exactly the people who would find it useful. A rancher named Harlon from the north end of the valley came over 2 weeks after that with 4 wagon covers in the bed of his wagon, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and asked in the careful way of a man who is not quite sure of his welcome whether the woman here could look at his covers and give him a figure. Cecilia looked at his covers. She gave him a figure. He accepted it without haggling. She began to charge. Not much. She set her prices low enough that a man would consider it foolish to drive to Casper and pay the harness shop when she was here, and her prices were a quarter of what the shop asked. But the quarters and the half-dollars came in, and she put them in a tin box separate from the household money, and she kept the ledger. Raymond watched all of this with a feeling he could not name precisely. He had wanted a wife to keep his house. His house was kept, the cabin was clean, the shirts were mended, there was bread in the mornings and a proper supper in the evenings, and the plank floor swept. Cecilia had done everything she had promised about the house and done it without complaint. But she had done this other thing besides, and the other thing was larger than the house in ways he had not anticipated and was not entirely comfortable with. Men who had once nodded at him with the careful sympathy of a valley that had quietly written off the Aldis place now stopped him at the fence line to ask how his gear was holding through the season. Something had changed in the way the valley saw the ranch, and the change had come from a woman on her knees in a barn with an awl and a spool of waxed linen thread. He was not sure what to do with this. He was a man accustomed to being the one who fixed things, or who failed to fix things but was at least the one responsible for the fixing. The situation he now found himself in was one he had no experience with and no language for. One evening toward the end of May, Orin Gale came to the cabin door after supper, which was not his habit, and stood on the step with something held in both hands. It was a canvas tarpaulin, old and folded, and even folded Raymond could see that it had been a long time since it had covered anything. Orin held it out to Cecilia with the manner of a man making a request he knows is probably foolish. "It covered my wife's furniture," he said, "when I brought it west 11 years ago. She passed 4 years back. I've kept the tarp in the bunkhouse since, but it's gone to rags, and I thought—" He stopped. He was not accustomed to explaining himself, and the explaining was costing him something. "I thought maybe you could look at it and tell me if there was anything to do." Cecilia took the tarpaulin from his hands and spread it across the kitchen table and went over it in the lamplight, section by section, the way she went over everything. She was quiet for a time, her hands moving across the cloth, finding the rot and the good in the line between them. "The edges are gone," she said at last. "But the center cloth, the part that was folded in all these years, is sound. It's only been protected from the air by being folded. There's enough good canvas here for a smaller tarpaulin. Whole and strong." She looked up at Orin. "It won't be the same size, but it'll be the same cloth. The part that mattered kept." Orin looked at the canvas spread on the table, and then he looked away at the wall, and then he said, "I'd be grateful," in a voice that was not quite steady. Cecilia built him a smaller tarpaulin from the center cloth, bound at the edges with new duck and stitched so it would last another 20 years. Orin carried it back to the bunkhouse and folded it carefully and set it on the shelf over his bunk. And after that he did not fold his arms when Cecilia came to the barn, and he began in small ways that he would not have named as anything to look out for her, making sure the barn floor was swept before she spread work on it, checking that the lanterns had oil on the evenings she worked late. Tad Spur, who had started as a skeptic and arrived at something closer to admiration by the route of paying attention, told anyone in town who would listen exactly how much money the Aldis ranch had saved since Mrs. Aldis arrived, in figures, because figures were the language of people who did not yet have a way to say what they actually meant. The last days of May came in warm and the grass was good on the far pastures, and Raymond rode out to check the cattle and came back in the early evening to find the yard busy in a way it had not been before. Halloran's wagon was there with 2 more covers for mending, and a freighter who had turned off the road after hearing something from someone in town stood talking with Cecilia beside his wagon while she examined the split tarpaulin on his load. Raymond reined in and sat his horse for a moment looking at this. The freighter was a heavy-set man with a schedule to keep and a tarp that would cost him a load of freight if it failed between here and the railhead. He was listening to Cecilia with the intent expression of a man who is interested in the answer, and Cecilia was speaking to him in the direct, particular way she had, explaining what was wrong and what she could do and what it would cost and how long it would take, all of it clear and specific, no wasted words. Raymond unsaddled his horse and turned it into the corral and went inside to wash up. That evening after supper, he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard, which was empty now but carried the evidence of the day's visitors in the wheel ruts and the boot prints. And he thought about Pruitt's words from the depot platform in April. He thought about them for a while, and then he thought he had been a fool, and then he thought that being a fool and knowing it was at least one step better than being a fool, without knowing it, and he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from his wife, who was working in her ledger by the lamp. The tin box on the shelf had grown heavier. He could see from the way it sat that it had grown heavier since the month began. "You've been keeping account of what comes in," he said. "Since the first day," she said, without looking up. He looked at the ledger and the 2 columns and the figures running down each page, and he thought about the dry grain and the mended gear and the freighter who had turned off the road and the way the valley was beginning to speak of the Aldis place, and he understood that the thing that was happening here was larger than curtains, had been larger from the first. He did not know yet what it would become. He only knew that the morning she had arrived and walked his yard with her hand on the torn canvas, reading the ranch the way a doctor reads a patient, she had seen something he had not been able to see himself. And whatever came of that seeing, the ranch was different for it. He was different for it. The lamp burned low, and outside the Wyoming dark came down full and quiet over the Sweetwater Valley. And inside the cabin, Cecilia Holt Aldis worked her figures in the ledger with the same calm attention she brought to everything. And Raymond sat across from her and drank his coffee and did not say what he was thinking. What he was thinking was that a man who had asked for curtains and been sent this woman was either the most fortunate fool in Wyoming or the least deserving. He had not yet decided which. Through the open window, carried on the spring air, came the distant sound of the train going north, late again as trains were in the spring, and somewhere out past the barn an owl called once and was answered by nothing, and the grass moved in the dark, and the Sweetwater Valley settled into the quiet of a place that is holding its breath between one thing and the next. The summer came in hot and dry across the Sweetwater Valley, the kind of heat that made the sage go silver, and the creek run thin between its banks, and the cattle drifted to the shade of the cut banks in the afternoons and stood there switching flies with the patience of creatures that have made their peace with discomfort. Raymond rode the far pastures and checked the water and came back each evening to a cabin that smelled of bread and coffee and something else he could not name precisely. The smell of a place that is being maintained by someone who cares about maintaining it, which is different from the smell of a place merely occupied. Cecilia worked through the summer gear the way she had worked through the spring gear, methodically, without hurry, taking each thing in its proper order of urgency. The tents came after the saddle gear, 2 of them. Canvas wall tents used when Orvin and Tad rode out to the far grass in July and August to watch the cattle through the dry weeks when predators came down from the high country looking for easy meals. Both tents leaked at every seam. One had a hole a dog could have jumped through, patched and repatched with pieces of different canvas that had pulled away from the original cloth because they had been stitched with the wrong thread and never waxed. Cecilia rebuilt them from the ridgepole down. She reseamed the roofs with a double-felled seam that locked the layers of cloth together so thoroughly that no thread was exposed to the weather. She sewed new sod cloth at the bottoms and reinforced the corners with leather patches set in at the guy rope points where the strain came hardest. When Tad and Orvin took them out to the far grass in late July, the tent stood through 2 hard afternoon storms without letting in enough water to dampen a blanket. Tad reported this back to Raymond with the satisfaction of a young man whose changed opinion has been confirmed by evidence. Orvin said nothing, but he oiled the leather patches before he packed the tent away at summer's end, which was his way of saying the same thing. The tin box on the kitchen shelf grew heavier through June and July. Neighbors from further up the valley began to appear in the yard with gear that wanted mending, not just canvas but harness, cinches, the leather work that Cecilia could not do with a saddler's precision but could stabilize and extend with careful stitching. She took what she could do honestly, and turned away what required tools she did not have, and the people she turned away remembered that she had been honest with them and came back with the things she could do. Raymond noticed that his neighbors now looked at him differently than they had in April. Men who had once spoken of the Aldis place in the careful past tense of something already failing now asked his advice on gear care and canvas maintenance, because the word was around that the ranch had found a way to make its equipment last, and the figures behind that way were specific enough to be convincing. He was not accustomed to being consulted. He found he was not opposed to it. The county fair came at the end of August in Sweetwater Crossing. 3 days of livestock judging and horse racing, and the various competitions that gave the valley a reason to gather, and the women a reason to bring their best preserved fruit, and their best quilts, and their best bread, and the men a reason to stand around looking at other men's cattle and forming opinions they would carry through the winter. Raymond and Cecilia went on the first day. Cecilia brought the tin box because there was a canvas merchant from Casper who set up at the fair each year, and she wanted to look at his stock and his prices and compare them against what she had been paying through Voss at the mercantile. It was there, standing at the canvas merchant's stall in the morning light, that they heard the news. It came in pieces, the way news travels at a fair. A rancher telling another rancher who told a woman buying ribbon who mentioned it to her husband loud enough for the people around her to hear. The Wyoming Central Railroad was pushing a spur line north from its main track, surveying a route up through the Sweetwater Valley toward the timber country in the mountains. A construction camp, survey crew first, then the full building crew, would be moving into the valley by September. 100 men, maybe more. Tents, wagon covers, tarpaulins, grain sacks, harness, all the gear that a large construction outfit requires, and all of it subject to the particular violence that hard work in hard country inflicts on canvas and leather. Raymond heard it and began thinking about what 100 men would spend at Voss's mercantile. Cecilia heard it and went still. He noticed the stillness because he had learned to notice it, the way she went quiet when she was reading something, finding the place where it would mend or where it would not. She stood with the tin box in her hands, and her eyes not quite focused on the canvas merchant's stock, and he could see her working through something that was not yet words. On the other side of the merchant's stall, Harlon Voss stood with his own hands in his vest pockets, listening to the same conversation with a different quality of stillness, the stillness of a man adding figures in his head and finding the sum to his liking. Voss was 53 and had been the only merchant within 40 miles of Sweetwater Crossing for 2 decades, and he wore that position the way some men wear prosperity, not lightly, but as a confirmation of a natural order he believed in and intended to maintain. A railroad construction camp meant 100 men who would wear out their gear and have to replace it. And replacing it meant buying it, and buying it meant buying it from the only store within reasonable distance. He had already decided to increase his canvas stock before the fair ended. He noticed Cecilia standing at the merchant's stall. He noticed the tin box in her hands. He turned away without expression. On the drive home that evening, the light going long and amber across the valley floor, Cecilia was quiet in the way that meant she was still working through something. Raymond let the quiet run. He had learned that her quiet was not empty. After a time she said, "The railroad camp will need its gear maintained. Not just bought new, maintained through the building season, which will run into winter." "Voss'll get that trade," Raymond said. "He's been the only store here long enough that people go to him without thinking about it." "People go to him because there's no reason not to," Cecilia said. "That's different from loyalty." She looked at the road ahead. New canvas is expensive. Mended canvas costs a fraction of new and lasts nearly as long if the mending is done right. A quartermaster responsible for 100 men's gear and a budget set by people in an office in Cheyenne has a strong interest in that fraction. Raymond thought about this. "You'd need to talk to whoever runs the camp supplies," he said. "Yes," she said. "Those men don't know you." "They will," she said, and did not say it with any particular pride, only as a statement of what was going to be true. The survey crew arrived in the second week of September and pitched its camp along the survey line 3 miles east of the Aldis Ranch. 16 tents and the equipment of a professional outfit, the kind of camp that was organized and maintained because the Wyoming Central Superintendent in Cheyenne had opinions about disorder and expressed them in writing. The quartermaster who ran the camp's supplies was a man named August Prell, compact and direct, with close-cropped gray hair and the manner of someone who has spent 20 years keeping large numbers of men fed and sheltered and has no patience for waste or inefficiency. Cecilia rode out to the camp on a Tuesday morning. She did not send word ahead. She rode out with her ledger under her arm and tied her horse at the camp's picket line and asked the first man she saw for the quartermaster. And when Prell came out of the supply tent and looked at her with the careful expression of a man trying to determine which category of problem has just arrived, she introduced herself and told him she had a proposal she thought would interest him, and she asked if he had 10 minutes. Prell had 10 minutes. She opened the ledger on the camp supply table, turned it to the 2 columns, and walked him through the figures she had accumulated over the summer. What canvas cost new, what it cost to mend, what the difference came to over a season of hard use. She showed him the range of gear she had worked on, the quality of the repairs, the weather the repairs had held through. She told him what she could do for the camp's existing canvas on a contract basis, keep it maintained through the building season so that his budget went toward productive work rather than toward replacing gear that could be extended. She named a figure. Prell looked at the ledger. He looked at the figure she had named. He read the 2 columns again with the attention of a man who has learned not to be in a hurry about numbers. Then he said, "Can you start Monday?" Cecilia said she could start Monday. She rode home with the contract. Prell had written it out himself, 2 copies, both signed, in her saddlebag and the ledger under her arm, and she came into the kitchen and set both on the table and told Raymond what had happened in the same calm, specific way she told him everything. Raymond read the contract. He read the figure. He looked at his wife for a long moment. "You went out there this morning," he said. "Yes, without telling me. I didn't know if there was anything to tell until I knew," she said. "Now there is." He thought about this. He thought about it for longer than he needed to, because what he was actually thinking about was not the contract or the figure, but the quality of the thing itself. The way she had ridden out to that camp with her ledger and her figures and come back with a signed agreement, not because she had asked anyone's permission or waited to be invited, but because she had seen a thing that needed doing and done it. He was not entirely comfortable with how much he admired this. "Folks'll have opinions," he said. It was the same thing he had said in April, and he knew it when he said it. Cecilia looked at him with the expression of someone who has already answered this question and is prepared to answer it again as many times as necessary. "They will," she said. "They can keep them." Harlon Voss heard about the contract within 2 days. He heard it from a teamster who had been at the camp the morning Cecilia rode out, who had watched the whole transaction with the attention of a man who makes his living knowing where goods come from and where they go. Voss listened to the teamster's account in the back room of the mercantile with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged into an expression that gave nothing away. After the teamster left, he sat alone for a while. He had built his business on the geography of the valley. The fact that he was here and the next nearest store was 40 miles and a day's travel. Geography had always been enough. It had been enough for 20 years, but geography did not help him against a woman 3 miles from the railroad camp who could keep canvas alive rather than requiring it to be replaced, because the gap between her price and his was not a gap that freight costs or convenience could close. She was not competing with him on price. She was competing with him on the nature of the product itself. She was selling a service that made his merchandise last longer, which was a different kind of competition than any he had faced before. He sat in the back room and thought about this for a long while. And then he began to make decisions that were not about fixing the problem, but about eliminating the person who had created it. The talk started small, the way talk does when it is being managed by someone who knows how to manage it. It did not originate with Voss directly. He was too careful for that, too aware of how a man's credibility in a valley depends on being seen as reasonable. Instead, it originated with people who had reason to want his goodwill, carried in the careful way of a statement that is not quite a statement, a wondering aloud, a question posed with an expression of concern. There was something unseemly, the talk suggested, about a married woman taking contracts on her own, about a woman going out to a camp of men and conducting business without her husband's knowledge, about the kind of canvas work that was done on the ground and in the field, which was not a woman's proper place. And there was a question, the talk further suggested, about the quality of mended canvas, because canvas that had been mended was canvas that had already failed once, and a seam that had been repaired was a seam with a history, and could you really trust a thing with a history to hold when the weather came hard? Some of it found purchase. Some of it always does. Tad Spur heard it in town on a Saturday and came back to the ranch with it, the way a young man carries news he does not know what to do with, loudly, before he had thought it through. He said it at the supper table, which was poor judgment, but Tad's judgment had never been his strongest feature. He reported what he had heard in town about the talk regarding Mrs. Aldis and the railroad camp, delivered with the emphasis of someone who thinks he is being helpful by conveying information and has not yet understood that there are kinds of information that are not help. Raymond listened to this without expression. After supper, when Cecilia had gone to the barn to check on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg, Raymond sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and thought about what Tad had said. He thought about the talk, and where it came from, and what it meant, and what he ought to do about it. And then he thought about something else. He thought about the fact that he had heard similar talk earlier in the week, not from Tad, but from Pruitt, who had mentioned it with the careful embarrassment of a friend delivering a message he has been asked to deliver and does not much want to. Pruitt had framed it as a concern. He had used the word unseemly, and Raymond, sitting across from Pruitt at the fence line between their properties, had said nothing in response. He had not defended his wife. He had listened to the word unseemly applied to a woman who had spent 6 months saving his ranch from the rot that had been eating it for 3 years before she arrived, and he had said nothing, because somewhere underneath his admiration for what she was doing there was an older, quieter voice that was not entirely comfortable with the way she was doing it, and that voice had kept him silent when he should have spoken. He sat with this understanding in the lamplight, and it was not a comfortable thing to sit with. He did not go to the barn. He told himself it was because she would be a while with the mare. But the truth was that he did not yet know what to say, and he was not a man who spoke before he knew what he meant. Cecilia came in from the barn and saw him at the table and understood from the quality of his sitting that something was working in him. She had learned to read his silences the way he had learned to notice hers. She made tea and sat down across from him and did not prompt him, because she had also learned that he came to things in his own time and pressing him arrived nowhere useful. The lamp threw its yellow circle across the table between them. Raymond said, "There's talk in town." "I know," Cecilia said. "Pruitt mentioned it to me 3 days ago." A pause. Cecilia set down her cup. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No." Another pause, longer. Outside, the mare moved in the barn and settled. "Did you say anything to Pruitt?" she asked. He looked at the lamp. No. The silence that followed this was different from the silences they had learned to be comfortable with. This one had weight in it, and the weight was specific. Cecilia did not say anything for a long time, and when she did speak, her voice was even. But it was the evenness of something held carefully, not the evenness of something that did not need holding. "I see," she said. Raymond looked at her. "I should have," he said. "I know that." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He waited for more. She did not give him more, because she was not a woman who said more than the situation required. And what the situation required was exactly what she had said. He went to bed that night with the discomfort of a man who has discovered a fault in himself that he cannot argue away. He was not a man who enjoyed that discovery, but he was honest enough not to avoid it. Cecilia lay in the dark beside him and did not sleep well either. The crack between them was not wide, but it was there, and they both knew it was there, and knowing made it feel wider than it was. She rode to the camp on Monday as agreed. She did not discuss the weekend's conversation further, and neither did he. And this was not because it was resolved, but because they were both people who moved forward by moving forward, and standing still looking at a damage does not mend it. She brought Tad with her to the camp because she needed an extra pair of hands for the heavier work, and because Tad's hands were now competent. He had spent the summer learning the seams, the flat seam, the felled seam, the round seam for rope work, and he could work a piece of canvas with enough skill to be genuinely useful rather than merely enthusiastic. The camp's gear was in the condition that gear is always in when a large outfit has been moving through rough country for several weeks. Worn at the stress points, split where the weight had been concentrated, the factory seams beginning to open where they had never been properly set in the first place. Cecilia worked through the camp's inventory with Prell, assessed each piece, sorted the urgent from the manageable, and set to work. She re-seamed the mess tents first because the mess tents fed 100 men, and a failed mess tent meant 100 men eating cold in the weather. By the end of the second week of September, the camp's canvas was in better condition than it had been when the outfit left the railhead. Prell made a note of this in the log he kept for the superintendent in Cheyenne, because Prell was a man who wrote things down, and things written down in Prell's log had a way of becoming policy. And then October came in from the mountains with its particular authority, and in the first week the authority announced itself fully. The storm built through the afternoon of the third day of October, the sky going from blue to white to gray in the space of 4 hours, the temperature dropping 15 degrees between noon and sundown, the wind shifting to the northwest and beginning to move in earnest. By evening it was raining hard, a cold, driving rain that came in sheets across the valley, and by midnight it had gone to sleep. Raymond sat up past midnight watching the sky through the cabin window and thinking about the cattle on the far pasture and the gear in the barn and the tents at the railroad camp 3 miles east. He thought about the mending Cecilia had done on the camp's 2 main mess tents the previous week, the double-felled seams, the waxed thread, the leather patches at the corner stakes. He thought for a moment about the tent he had not seen her work on, a large supply tent Prell had told her was new in September and did not need attention. He went to bed eventually. The sleet drove against the cabin windows. In the morning the storm was still running, reduced to a cold gray rain but persistent. Raymond dressed before light and went to check the barn. He did not yet know what had happened at the camp. What had happened at the camp was this. At some point in the deepest part of the night, when the storm was at its worst and the wind was driving the sleet sideways across the survey line, the large supply tent had failed. Not at a seam Cecilia had touched, not at a repair or a patch or any point she had assessed or worked on. It had failed along a factory seam near the ridgepole, a seam that had been stitched at the manufacturer's with a single thread, unwaxed, pulled tight enough to hold in dry weather in ordinary use, but not set deeply enough to withstand the combination of water weight and wind load that the October storm put on it. The thread had wicked the water through the weave over 6 weeks of use, and the moisture had worked at the stitching until the stitching let go, and when it let go all at once, the way failures do when they have been building quietly for a long time. The tent came down on the camp's flour supply and the bedrolls of 3 men who had been sleeping on the supply side of the tent. The flour was ruined. The men were cold and wet and angry and unhurt, which was the best possible outcome of a bad situation. But it was still a bad situation, and in the gray, miserable morning after, with the flour bagged in soggy heaps and the men wringing out their bedrolls, the story that moved through the camp was the story that always moves through a camp after a failure. Simple, immediate, looking for a cause that was close at hand. The woman was responsible for the camp's canvas. The canvas had failed. Therefore, the logic was not good logic, but it was the logic available at 6 in the morning in cold rain with ruined flour and wet blankets. Voss's teamster, the one who made deliveries to the camp twice a week and owed Voss for a store account 3 months in arrears, heard the story at 6:15 and was on his way to town by 6:30. Cecilia was on her horse by first light. She had not been sent for. No one had ridden to the Aldis ranch in the dark to tell her what had happened. She had lain awake through the worst of the storm listening to the wind and the sleet, and in the morning she had made the same calculation Raymond had made in reverse. She had thought about what the storm would have tested, and she had thought about the new supply tent that she had not been asked to assess. And she had saddled her horse before breakfast and told Raymond where she was going without explaining why, and ridden east in the cold morning rain. Tad came after her. He had seen her saddle up and had made his own calculation, and his calculation ended in the same place hers had. She reached the camp as Prell was crossing the yard toward the collapsed tent with his jaw set and the expression of a man who is composing in his head the message he will have to send to Cheyenne. He saw her and changed direction. "I was about to send for you," he said. "I know," she said. "Show me which tent." He showed her. She dismounted and handed her reins to Tad and walked to the collapsed tent and began pulling the canvas back from the wreckage of the flour bags. She worked quickly and without commentary, pulling the heavy wet canvas to the side until she had exposed the failed seam, the ridgepole seam, split from one side to the other, the thread rotted and parted in a single clean line. She crouched in the mud and took the failed seam in both hands. Prell stood over her. "This is going to cost me a day's work, and $40 in flour," he said. "And I've been told this morning that your work was behind it." Cecilia did not flinch. She did not look up immediately. She held the failed seam in both hands, and she looked at it with the same attention she brought to everything, taking it apart in her mind, reading it the way her father had taught her to read a seam, not for what it looked like, but for what it told. Then she held it up so Prell could see both faces of the cloth. "Look at the thread," she said. He crouched beside her. "Single stitched," she said. "No felling, no wax. You can see where the thread is gone. The moisture wicked straight through it, and once it was wet, it rotted in 6 weeks. This is a factory seam, mister." "Prell, I did not touch this tent. You told me it came new in September, and I took you at your word and did not ask to examine it. That was the error, mine and yours both. But the work that failed here is not my work." She laid the failed seam on the ground between them. "Come with me," she said. She walked him to the 2 mess tents she had reseamed the week before. Both stood. Both were dark with rain, and solid under it, the canvas bearing the weight of the water the way canvas does when it has been properly set, shedding what it could, holding what it could not shed, the seams intact under everything the storm had sent. She showed him the seams on the standing tents, double-felled, waxed thread dark with it, each stitch sealed. She showed him the stitching on the ridgepole where she had reinforced the original factory seam from the inside with a second row of stitches set perpendicular to the first. Then she walked him back to the failed tent and showed him the ridgepole seam again. Single thread, no wax, no reinforcement. Prell crouched over the failed seam for a long time. Tad, standing by the horses, said quietly to no one in particular, "That tent came from Voss's mercantile. I was here when it arrived. I saw the invoice." Prell stood. He looked at Tad. He looked at the failed seam. He looked at the standing tents with their dark waxed seams bearing the rain without complaint. Then he said, "I want to see every piece of canvas in this camp." They spent the morning going through the camp's full inventory, every tent and tarpaulin and wagon cover and supply cover, laying each piece out and examining the seams. Every piece Cecilia had touched held. Every seam she had set was intact, the wax still dark in the stitching, the felling tight, the thread with no sign of the wicking and rot that had taken the supply tent's ridgepole. 3 other pieces that had come from Voss's mercantile in September, new, delivered on the invoice Tad remembered, showed the same single dry thread at their critical seams. Not failed yet, but showing the early signs. Prell could see it himself once he was looking for it. He straightened up from the last piece and looked at Cecilia. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me a straight account," she said. "The apology can wait. Those 3 pieces need to be reseamed before the next storm, or you'll lose them the same way you lost this one." Prell looked at the 3 pieces. He looked at the ruined supply tent. "What will it take?" he said. 2 days, she said. "Tad and I can do it." "Do it," he said. Then he went to his supply records and pulled the invoices for everything that had come from Voss's mercantile in September, and he sat at his camp table in the rain and went through them with the attention of a man who has been given reason to look carefully at things he had previously taken on trust. What he found, across that gray October morning, rearranged several of his assumptions about the source of his camp's supply problems and the reliability of the merchant who had presented himself as the obvious choice for a construction camp's needs. By noon, August Prell had renewed his contract with Cecilia and expanded it to cover every piece of canvas in the camp without exception, and he had written a short note to his contact at the Wyoming Central Supply Office in Cheyenne, recommending that the railroad's purchasing department look carefully at the quality standards of any canvas goods sourced from Sweetwater Crossing's mercantile before committing to further orders. He had also struck Harlon Voss's name from the camp's supplier list. Voss heard about this within the day, because the teamster who owed him money was also the teamster who delivered Prell's outgoing mail to the depot, and reading other people's correspondence was a habit the teamster had never tried particularly hard to break. Voss sat in the back room of his mercantile that evening with the information the teamster had brought him, and he sat for a long time. What he thought about was not the railroad contract he had lost or the quality of the canvas he had sold to the camp. He thought about the note he had purchased 3 weeks ago from the lawyer who held the debt of the previous owner of a certain 400 acres along the Sweetwater River. He had bought it quietly as a precaution, the way a careful man acquires insurance against outcomes he cannot fully predict. At the time he had thought of it as a background option, a last resort available if other approaches proved insufficient. Other approaches had now proved insufficient. He opened his desk drawer and took out the leather folder with the note inside it, and he looked at the figure written on the paper in the lawyer's careful hand. $312. Due on demand. Secured against the land and improvements of the Aldis Ranch, Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory. He put the folder back in the drawer. He would let it run another week. Let the Aldis woman think the storm had been the end of it. Let the valley settle back into its ordinary rhythms. And then he would ride out on a fine morning with the leather folder under his arm, and he would collect what the paper entitled him to, and he would do it before Christmas. That was the plan he arrived at, sitting alone in the back room of his mercantile while the rain moved down the valley and the lamp burned low on his table. Outside, 3 miles east, Cecilia and Tad were working by lamplight in the camp's supply area, laying out the 3 compromised tent sections on dry boards and beginning the work of pulling the bad seams and replacing them with seams that would hold. Cecilia worked with the same attention she brought to everything, no more, no less, not hurried by the cold or the hour or the knowledge of what the morning's events had cost her in reputation before the truth came clear. She had been blamed for a failure that was not hers, and she had answered the blame with evidence, and the evidence had been sufficient. But she had also seen, in the way the blame had moved through the camp before the morning was half gone, how quickly a story runs when someone is managing it, and she understood, without yet knowing the full shape of what was coming, that the morning's events had not been accidental. The tent had not been her work. But someone had made sure the camp heard otherwise before the canvas had finished falling. She pulled the bad thread from the seam with steady hands and began setting the new stitching, drawing the waxed thread through the cloth with the curved needle her father had given her, each stitch placed exactly where it needed to be, each one sealed as she pulled it tight. Tad worked the other end of the seam without talking, because he had learned that the time for talking and the time for working were different times. The lamp threw their shadows long across the tent canvas, and outside the rain came down steadily over the Sweetwater Valley. And somewhere in the darkness between the camp and the town, Harlon Voss's decision sat waiting in a leather folder in a locked desk drawer, gathering the patience of something that does not need to hurry because it believes it has already won. Harlon Voss rode out on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of October, when the storm had been gone 5 days and the valley had returned to the clarity that follows hard weather in Wyoming. The air scrubbed clean, the mountains sharp against the sky, the grass silver with frost that burned off by mid-morning and left the light brilliant and cold. He rode his best horse, a dark bay that he kept for appearances rather than work, and he carried the leather folder under his arm with the ease of a man who has rehearsed the scene he is about to perform and is confident in his lines. Raymond was in the yard when Voss came through the gate. He had been repairing a section of corral fence that the storm had pushed out of true, working a post back into plumb with a bar and his own weight against it, and he straightened up when he heard the horse and stood with the bar in his hands and watched Voss come across the yard on the dark bay with the leather folder and the expression that men wear when they believe they hold the winning card and have been waiting a long time to play it. Voss dismounted and tied the bay to the corral rail and said good morning in the tone of a man for whom the morning is indeed good, and then he opened the leather folder and took out the paper inside it and held it out. Raymond wiped his hands on his trousers and took it. He read it once. He read it again. It was a promissory note, dated 6 years before he had bought the property, signed by the man he had bought it from, a man named Driscoll who had come west with ambitions that the country had not confirmed and who had sold the ranch at a loss to Raymond and disappeared east. The note was for $312, secured against the land and improvements, and at the bottom was a line in different handwriting, dated 3 weeks prior, indicating that the note had been assigned to Harlon Voss, Sweetwater Crossing, Wyoming Territory, for consideration received. Due on demand. Raymond stood in the yard with the paper in his hands and the cold morning light on his face and felt the ground beneath him do something he had not felt it do since the first year he had come west, and understood for the first time that the country did not care whether he succeeded or failed. It tilted, not physically, but in the way that certainty tilts when something you believed was solid turns out to have been resting on a foundation you never knew was there. $312. His cattle would not make that. Not in 30 days. Not in 60. The fall market had been soft and he had sold what he could at prices that left him ahead of the season's costs, but not ahead by $300. The ranch's earnings did not approach it. The ground itself was worth more than the debt, but the ground was exactly what the debt was secured against. And a man holding a legal note had rights that a man's years of work on a property did not override. 30 days, Voss said pleasantly. That's what the standard terms allow. I don't want to be unreasonable about it. He retrieved the note from Raymond's hands. Raymond let it go without quite meaning to, and put it back in the leather folder, and got back on his bay horse, and rode out of the yard with the unhurried ease of a man who has done what he came to do and is in no hurry because time is now working for him. Raymond stood in the yard for a long time after the sound of the horse had gone. Cecilia had been in the barn when Voss arrived, going over a set of harness that had come in from a rancher up the valley. She came out when she heard the horse leave and found Raymond standing by the corral with the bar still in his hand and his face doing something she had not seen it do before. She looked at his face. She looked at the yard where the hoofprints of Voss's bay were still fresh in the frost-stopped ground. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He gave her the whole of it. The note, the figure, the 30 days, the name of the man who had sold him the property and apparently taken a loan against it before the sale that had never been disclosed and never been cleared. He told it plainly, without self-pity, the way he told things when they were serious enough that decoration would be an insult to them. Cecilia listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the ledger had lived since April, where the sailmaker's box still sat in its corner, where the tin box on the shelf had grown from a small thing of quarters and half-dollars to a heavier thing of folded banknotes. The morning light came through the bare window. The curtain fabric was still on its shelf, still folded in its brown paper, still patient. Raymond put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. $312, he said, in 30 days. I've built this place out of nothing for 4 years, and a man behind a counter who has never broken sod in his life is going to take it with a piece of paper he bought for pennies. How much did he pay for it? Cecilia asked. I don't know, whatever Driscoll's estate would take. 20 cents on the dollar, maybe less. Cecilia was quiet. She had gone into the stillness he had learned to recognize, the stillness of reading, finding the place where the damage was and where it was not, and what the soundcloth between them might bear. You're calculating it like a rancher, she said at last. He looked up. 30 days of cattle and grass, she said. And you're right, there's nothing in cattle and grass. Not in 30 days. Then how else is there to calculate it? She reached across the table and pulled the ledger to her. She opened it to the last page with figures on it, and she set it between them with the 2 columns facing him, the long column on the left, the short column on the right, and at the bottom of the short column the running sum that the summer and fall had built. Tell me what you see, she said. He looked at the numbers. He had looked at them before, many times, but he looked at them now differently, with the kind of attention that desperation sharpens, making a man see things he has looked past because he did not yet need them. He followed the short column from the top. The wagon cover, the tents, the saddle gear, the grain sacks, the growing stream of work from the valley's ranchers and the freighter and the women Nora Crane had sent her way. And then the railroad camp, the first contract with Prell, the doubled contract after the storm, the work that was running now, steady and reliable, canvas coming in torn and going out sound, and the monthly payment coming in with the same reliability. He added the figures at the bottom of the short column in his head and looked at his wife. It's not there yet, he said. No, she said, not yet. She paused. But I haven't asked Prell for what I'm going to ask him tomorrow. He waited. The camp will build through autumn and into winter, she said. 100 men. Their gear wears every week. New canvas and harness freighted up from the railhead costs twice what I charge and takes a week to arrive. Prell knows this. He's been writing it in his log. She leaned forward slightly, her forearms on the table, her eyes on his. What if I don't just maintain the camp's gear as it fails? What if I run a proper canvas works? Here in the barn, staffed and stocked, keeping the whole line's gear sound through the building season. Not piece by piece as things come apart, but systematically, the way a ship's chandler maintains a fleet. One price, one contract, one monthly payment that covers everything. And I need the first month paid in advance to set up properly. Raymond looked at her. Prell would go for that? Prell is a man who answers to people in Cheyenne who love nothing better than a saved dollar shown plainly in a column, she said. I'm going to show him the column. She pulled the ledger back toward her and turned to a clean page and began writing figures. Not the figures of what had already been saved, but the figures of what would be saved, multiplied across 100 men and 4 months of winter use, the cost of new gear against the cost of maintained gear, the freight savings, the time savings, the value of having a repair operation 3 miles from the work site rather than a week's freight away. Raymond watched her build the figures, and he felt something shift in him. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the first movement in the direction of hope, the sense of a thing that might be real if the ground held long enough to build on. She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she turned the ledger to face him. He read the figure at the bottom. He read it again. He'll want to see the short column, he said. I'll bring the whole ledger, she said. In the morning, Cecilia rode to the camp. She did not take Tad this time. This was not a work visit, it was a business visit, and she rode alone with the ledger in her saddlebag and arrived at the camp supply tent before Prell had finished his morning rounds. She asked for half an hour of his time. He gave her an hour. She opened the ledger on his camp table and walked him through it the way she had walked him through the tent seams in the mud a week before, specifically, without decoration, letting the figures speak in the plain language that figures speak when they have been kept honestly. She showed him the history of what maintained canvas cost against what replaced canvas cost. She showed him the freight calculation, what it cost the railroad to bring new gear up from the railhead against what it cost to maintain existing gear on site. She showed him the projection for 4 months of winter building, 100 men, the full range of gear the camp used. The figure at the bottom of the projection was large enough that Prell read it twice, the way Raymond had read it twice. Not because he doubted the arithmetic, but because the arithmetic was saying something that took a moment to fully land. This assumes I give you everything, Prell said. Every piece of canvas in the camp, new and old, under your contract. Yes, Cecilia said, and you'll set up a proper works, not repairs out of a saddlebag. In the Aldis barn, she said, tables, stock, staff. A proper operation. Prell looked at the projection. He looked at the ledger history behind it. He had spent 20 years keeping large outfits supplied through hard conditions, and the ledger in front of him was the cleanest and most specific accounting he had seen outside of a railroad office. The woman who had kept it had also, 2 weeks ago, risen before dawn in a rainstorm to ride to his camp and prove with 2 seams held side by side that the failure he was about to blame on her was not her failure. He had not forgotten this. "What do you need to set up?" he said. She told him. Canvas stock, thread, wax, leather for the patches, 2 long work tables, adequate lamplight for winter hours, and the wages of the women she would hire to staff the operation. And the first month paid in advance, she said, to cover setup costs before the work revenue builds. Prell looked at the figures she had written for the monthly payment. "That's fair," he said. He called his camp clerk and had the contract written out that afternoon, 2 copies, both signed and witnessed. The first month's payment, advance as agreed, was paid in currency from the camp's operating funds, counted out on the supply table by the clerk while Prell watched, and Cecilia put the bills into the ledger to keep them flat. She rode home with the signed contract in her saddlebag and $140 in the ledger and the cold October light burning gold across the valley grass. Raymond was at the kitchen table when she came in, the bar from the corral fence leaning against the wall where he had left it when Voss rode away that morning. He had not gone back to the fence. He had sat at the kitchen table for most of the day with his hands on the table, and the stillness of a man who is waiting for something he cannot hurry. She set the contract on the table. She set the ledger beside it, open to the page where the advance sat fresh in the column. He looked at the contract. He looked at the figure. He looked at his wife. "It's not 312 yet," she said, "but it's the beginning of it, and we have 26 days. He nodded slowly, reading the contract. Then he looked up. "Cecilia," he said. She waited. He looked at his hands on the table. He was a man who came to the important things in his own time and in his own way, and she had learned this about him, and she waited without prompting. "Pruitt told me about the talk," he said. "3 weeks ago. I didn't." He stopped. He started again. "I didn't say what I should have said. I let it sit because there was a part of me that wasn't." Another stop. He looked up at her. "I was wrong. Not confused. Wrong. And you knew I was wrong, and you didn't say so, and I think you didn't say so because you knew I'd have to come to it myself." "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. It was not a long speech and it was not an eloquent one, but it was the kind of sorry that costs something to say, which is the only kind worth giving. Cecilia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know you are. Don't do it again." "No," he said. She sat down across from him and opened the ledger to the planning page and put her finger on the column of figures. "Now, we have 26 days and we need $172 more in this column. Let me show you how we're going to get them." She talked for 2 hours, and Raymond listened with the full attention of a man who has decided to stop having reservations, which is a different quality of listening than any he had previously brought to the subject. She walked him through the barn conversion, the long tables Orvin and Tad could build in a day from lumber she had already priced at the mill, the lamplight rigging, the stock layout. She walked him through the staffing, Tad as floor manager, 2 of Nora Crane's granddaughters who had quick hands and households that could use the wages, 3 other women from the valley she had already spoken to informally, women whose needlework was sound and whose willingness was certain. She walked him through the work schedule, the camp's gear coming in on Mondays and Thursdays by wagon, going back out repaired on Tuesdays and Fridays, a steady rhythm that would build the monthly revenue as the weeks ran. And she walked him through the arithmetic of the 30 days. The advance already in the ledger, the first full week's work already spoken for, the projections for each of the remaining weeks built conservatively at 3/4 of expected volume rather than full volume, so that the target was reachable, even if things went slower than planned. At the bottom of the calculation, she had written the date of Voss's deadline and the figure they needed and the figure they would have if the work went as projected. On the morning of that date, the figure they would have was $315. "3 extra," Raymond said. "So there's no question about the count," she said. "And so he can't claim a discrepancy." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want Prell there when we pay him." It was not a question. She had already thought of it. "Prell will be there," she said. The barn conversion took Orvin and Tad 2 days, which was 1 day faster than Cecilia had estimated, because Orvin had decided the project deserved his full attention, and Orvin's full attention was a considerable thing. The long tables went in along the north wall where the lamplight would fall across them properly. The stock was arranged at the south end, the canvas rolls, the thread spools on their pegs, the wax blocks in their box, the leather patches sorted by size. 2 large lanterns hung from the ridgepole on chains that could be raised and lowered, and 3 smaller lanterns on hooks along the wall gave the stitchers enough light to work fine seams without straining. The women came on Wednesday. Nora Crane's granddaughters arrived first, Della and Ruth, 22 and 19. With the capable hands of women who had been doing hard work since they were children, and the manner of people who have been waiting for someone to give them a reason to be paid for it. Then 3 women from further up the valley. A widow named Forsyth who had run her late husband's harness repair for 2 years before the business had failed for reasons that had nothing to do with her work. A young woman named Sable Whitmore whose husband was a carpenter working the railroad camp, and who had 3 children and a needle as fast as any Cecilia had seen, and a ranch wife named Greta Elam who was quieter than the others but whose stitching, when Cecilia examined it, was as even and tight as if it had been set by machine. Cecilia stood at the head of the long table and showed them the seams. The flat seam first, because it was the foundation, the way the edges were turned and pressed and locked before the stitching went in, so the cloth held even if a stitch pulled free. Then the felled seam, the one that shed water rather than collecting it, the trick of the double fold that made the canvas twice as strong along its length as it was across it. Then the waxing, how to draw the thread through the block so each stitch sealed as it was placed, not afterward, and why the sealing mattered more than people who had not watched canvas fail in rain understood. She showed them how to read a piece of canvas for where it would next fail. The stress points, the strain lines, the places where the weave went tight or the cloth had sun-rotted and gone brittle from long exposure. This was the part her father had called reading the cloth, and it was the part that could not be fully taught, only practiced. But she gave them the language for what they were seeing and let the practice begin. By Thursday afternoon, the first load of camp gear had arrived from Prell's wagon. 17 pieces, everything from small tarpaulins to a large mess tent that had been developing a seam problem along the entrance flap. By Friday evening, 14 of the 17 pieces had gone back to camp, repaired and waxed and documented in the inventory log Cecilia kept for every piece that passed through the barn. Prell's driver, a laconic man named Hoyt who had been making the run twice a week and had formed no opinion about anything he transported, examined the 14 returned pieces with the attention of someone who has been asked by his employer to verify quality and reported back to Prell that the work was sound. Prell made a note in his log. The ledger grew. Week 1 of the 30 days added to the advance and brought the column to $190. Week 2, with the operation running at full rhythm and 2 additional ranchers from the north end of the valley bringing work after Nora Crane mentioned what was happening in the Aldis barn, brought it to 240. Week 3 was the longest week. The work was steady, but one of the camp's large wagon covers required a full rebuild that took 3 days and compressed the week's output, and it brought the column to 280. 7 days remained. Cecilia did not show Raymond the ledger during the 3 weeks. Not because she was keeping it from him, but because he had stopped needing to see it in the way he had needed to see it before. He was present now in a different way, not watching the operation with the anxiety of a man who doesn't trust what he's watching, but present in the way of a man who has made a decision about what he believes in and is acting on it. He helped Orvin keep the barn warm and the lamps full. He drove the gear to Prell's camp on the Monday and Thursday runs when Tad was needed at the tables. He fixed the corral fence and went back to the cattle and ran the ranch the way it needed running, and he left the barn to Cecilia because the barn was hers. On the last Wednesday of October, 6 days before Voss's deadline, Cecilia sent a note to August Prell asking if he would be available to ride out to the Aldis ranch on the morning of Saturday the 31st. She told him why. Prell sent back a single line, he would be there. On the Friday evening before, Cecilia opened the ledger to the final page and added the week's figures and sat with the result for a moment. Then she called Raymond in from the yard and set the ledger in front of him. He read the bottom figure. $317.40. He stood behind her chair and looked at the number for a long time. He did not say anything immediately, and Cecilia let the silence run the way she always let the important silences run, because some things need the space of silence to become real. 5 extra, he said at last. I revised the calculation, she said. Sable Whitmore works faster than I projected. I've been undercounting her output for 2 weeks. He put his hand on her shoulder. She put her hand over his. They stayed like that for a moment in the lamplight. The ledger opened between them, the 2 columns running down the page with the long one on the left that represented what things cost in a world that replaced instead of mended, and the short one on the right that represented what Cecilia Holt had built with a box of her father's tools, and the conviction that the difference between those 2 columns was where a person's real work lived. I'll put out 315, she said. Round numbers, clear and indisputable. And the rest goes back into stock, she said. We'll need more canvas thread before December. Saturday morning came in cold and bright, the mountains white above the timberline, the frost on the yard grass catching the early light. Raymond built the fire up before dawn and Cecilia made breakfast, and neither of them talked very much. The way people who have been through something together don't always need to talk about it to know they have been through it together. Orvin was in the barn before light, getting the day's work organized the way he always did now. The tables cleared from the previous day, the lamps trimmed, the stock checked. Tad arrived from the bunkhouse with his hair combed, which was unusual, and positioned himself near the barn doors with the manner of someone who intends to be present for what is coming. The women came, Della and Ruth and Sable Whitmore and Forsyth and Greta Elam, because it was a working Saturday and the work did not stop for drama, and because Cecilia had not told them to stay away and they had understood without being told that they ought to be there. August Prell rode in from the east at 9:30 alone, on a good gray horse, and tied up at the corral rail and nodded to Raymond and stood in the yard with the calm economy of a man who keeps appointments, because keeping appointments is how things get done. Harlon Voss arrived at 10. He came through the gate on the dark bay with the leather folder under his arm and the expression of a man approaching a transaction he has been looking forward to. And he came into the yard and took in what was there with a quality of attention that began confident and underwent, in the space of perhaps 10 seconds, a series of adjustments that his face did not fully succeed in concealing. He took in the barn doors open wide to the October morning, the long tables visible inside, the women at the tables with their heads down and their needles going. He took in the wagon in the yard, loaded with repaired canvas in neat rolls, wagon covers and tarpaulins in tent sections, each tagged with the inventory number Cecilia used in her log, ready for Hoyt to take back to the camp. He took in Tad Spur standing at the barn door with his arms at his sides, looking back at him with the expression of a 19-year-old who has learned something and knows it. He took in Orin Gale, who had not folded his arms at Cecilia since the evening of the tarpaulin, and who was not folding them now. He took in August Prell standing by the corral, and he took in what Prell's presence meant. He took in all of it in 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds, the expression of a man approaching a satisfying transaction became the expression of a man who has arrived at a place that is not the place he expected. Cecilia came out of the barn. She wore her working apron, and her hair was pinned back the way it always was when she worked, and she carried a cloth sack in both hands that hung with the weight of what was inside it. She came across the yard and stopped at the porch steps where Raymond stood, and she set the sack on the porch rail and looked at Voss. "Mr. Voss," she said, "you've come for the note." "I have," Voss said. He had recovered most of his expression by now. $312 due today. "Yes," she said. She opened the sack. She had arranged it deliberately. Not the banknotes from the Prell advance at the top, not the larger bills first, but a mixture of what the 30 days had produced, the way it had actually come in, the quarters and half dollars from the Valley ranchers mixed with the folded bills from the railroad payments, because she wanted the count to take as long as it deserved to take, and she wanted every person in that yard to hear each piece of it. She began to count. The quarters came first, stacked on the porch rail in columns of 4, each stack placed deliberately, the sound of coin on wood clear in the cold morning air. Tad had come to the barn door and stood listening. Orvin stood at the corner of the barn. Inside, the sound of needles had stopped. The women were listening, though none of them came to the door. Prell stood by the corral with his hands in his coat pockets and watched. The half-dollars followed the quarters. Then the folded bills, each one smoothed flat before it was laid on the rail, each denomination counted aloud in Cecilia's clear, even voice. The amounts accumulated on the rail, $20, $50, $80, $110, and Voss watched the counting with the expression of a man watching something he had not believed possible become slowly and irrefutably real. The counting went on. 150, 190, 230. The October wind came up the valley and moved the dry grass in the pasture, and the frost that was left in the shadows of the barn wall caught the light and held it, and Raymond stood on his porch with his hands at his sides and watched his wife count the money that was going to keep his land under his feet, and he understood, standing there, that the man he had been in April, the man who had stood on a depot platform thinking about curtains, was as far from him now as the eastern city Cecilia had come from, and that the distance between those two men had been traveled in large part because a woman had arrived with a box of tools, and the refusal to pretend that what the ranch needed was the same as what he thought he wanted. 270, 290. Voss's jaw had set. 310, 312. Cecilia placed the last $3 on the rail. 3 silver dollars, set down one at a time, each one deliberate. 315, she said. The note is for 312. The 3 extra, so there's no dispute about the count, and so you'll have no need to make change. She looked at Voss steadily. "Mr. Aldis," she said, without looking away from Voss, "the note, please." Voss stood for a moment with the leather folder under his arm and the money on the rail and the yard full of witnesses and the barn full of working women and the loaded wagon ready for the run to the railroad camp. And he understood with the complete understanding that comes when a plan has failed entirely that there was nothing left to do but what was being asked of him. He took the note from the folder and held it out. Raymond came off the porch and took it from his hand. He did not read it. He had read it already. He looked at it for a moment, and then he took it in both hands and tore it cleanly in 2, and tore each half in 2 again, and let the 4 pieces fall from his fingers onto the frost-cold ground of his own yard. Prell stepped forward from the corral. He spoke in the direct, carrying voice of a man accustomed to making himself heard over the noise of a construction camp. "Mr. Voss," he said, "you sold my camp a tent in September that failed in the first hard storm and cost me $40 in flour and 3 men a night in the cold. You spent the following month letting it be said around this valley that the failure was Mrs. Aldis's work when you knew, because you had sold us the tent, that the seam that failed was a factory seam she had never touched." He paused. "I've been in this country 20 years and I've dealt with a great many merchants and suppliers, and I've learned that a man's word about his goods is the most important thing he sells. I'll be telling what I know about the tent and the talk to anyone in this valley who wants to hear it, and I'll be putting it in writing to the Wyoming Central's purchasing office in Cheyenne, where it will be on record. He looked at Voss without hostility, but without any warmth either. A man's trade rests on his name, mister. Voss, you'd do well to mind yours. Voss's face had gone through several things during this speech and settled on something that was not quite any of them. He picked up the $315 from the porch rail, bill by bill and coin by coin, and put it in the leather folder where the note had been. His hands were not entirely steady. He produced a receipt book from his coat pocket and wrote the receipt standing at the porch rail, leaning on the folder to write against, and he wrote it in full. $312 received in payment of the promissory note, dated such and such, note hereby discharged in full, signed Harlon Voss, Sweetwater Crossing, Wyoming Territory, this 31st day of October, 1887. He tore the receipt from the book and held it out. Cecilia took it. She read it through and handed it to Prell, who read it and nodded and handed it back. Voss put the receipt book in his pocket and picked up the reins of the dark bay and mounted without looking at anyone in the yard. And he rode out through the gate and turned south toward town and did not look back. Raymond watched him go. He stood at the porch rail and watched the dark bay carry Harlon Voss down the road toward Sweetwater Crossing until the horse and rider were small against the sage flats, and then gone around the bend where the road dipped into the first draw south of the ranch, and the sound of hooves faded, and the valley was quiet again except for the wind in the grass, and from inside the barn, the sound that had resumed the moment Voss's horse went through the gate, the sound of needles at work. Prell shook hands with Raymond and then with Cecilia, and accepted a cup of coffee because Cecilia offered it, and the morning was cold, and he sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes talking about the winter build schedule and the gear he expected would need attention through December and January, and then he rode back to the camp on his gray horse, and the Saturday settled into itself. Tad went back to the barn. Orvin went to the horses. The women went back to their tables. Raymond stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard, the wagon waiting, the barn doors open, the smoke from the barn's small stove coming up thin and straight in the still cold air. He went out to help load the wagon. The winter came on and the canvas works found its rhythm. Gear arrived on Mondays and Thursdays, torn and worn and salt stiff from the hard weather. It went back out on Tuesdays and Fridays, sound and waxed and tagged, every seam recorded in Cecilia's inventory log. The women at the long tables grew faster as the weeks went on, their hands learning what their eyes had been taught, the work becoming a language they spoke without thinking about the words. Sable Whitmore could turn a large tarpaulin in an afternoon that had once taken a day and a half, and she did it without any drama, the way people do things they have decided to be good at. Tad Spur ran the floor with a competence that surprised no one who had watched the arc of his year. From the boy who had said it didn't seem fitting to the young man who made sure the tables were clean and the lamps were full and the incoming work was sorted before Cecilia needed to ask. He had learned, without anyone naming it as a lesson, that the best help is the kind that asks the fewest questions because it already knows the answers. Nora Crane came by on a Friday in November with eggs and her forthright manner and found the barn full and the work moving and sat in the kitchen with Cecilia for an hour. They talked about the valley and the winter, and the things that people who have lived a long time in a place talk about when they sit together in a warm kitchen while the cold presses at the window glass. Voss has gone quiet, Nora said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched a bully run out of room. Quieter than he's been in 20 years. He was always quiet, Cecilia said. He just used to be quiet in a way that cost people money. Nora laughed her short, genuine laugh and drank her coffee and went home to her 40 hens. The railroad camp built north through November and December, the survey line extending toward the timber country, and the gear wore steadily in the way the gear does when 100 men are working hard ground in hard weather. Hoyt's twice-weekly runs kept the barn supplied, and the ledger's short column kept growing. The Wyoming Central's purchasing office in Cheyenne received Prell's written report and filed it under the railroad's accounting of what had saved money that season, which is how large organizations remember the things that matter to them. Harlon Voss's mercantile did not close. A man with 20 years of valley trade does not lose it all in a season. But the valley had learned to look at a seam before it paid for one, and that habit, once learned, does not easily unlearn itself. Voss marked his canvas prices down the following spring. The railroad did not come back to him, and the ranchers who had once bought without examining now examined before they bought, and some of them drove to Casper, and some of them brought what they needed to the Aldis barn, and some of them simply made do longer with what they had, because a woman 3 miles down the creek had shown them that making do was a skill that could be learned. By the new year, January of 1888, the canvas works employed 6 women and had cleared, after every cost of stock and wages and barn maintenance, more than the Aldis cattle had earned in the previous 3 seasons put together. Cecilia's ledger had grown to its second book. The second book's short column was longer than the first book's long column had been. She kept the receipt from October tucked between the pages that covered that month's figures, where it could be found if it was ever needed. She did not think it would be needed. but she was a woman who kept things where they could be found. On a bright morning in the second week of January, Raymond stood at the kitchen window before the day began, looking out at the barn where the lamps were already lit and the first of the women had already arrived, and the day was starting the way it started now. With purpose, with the sound of work, with the evidence in every corner of the yard that the place had been pulled back from the slow disaster it had been sliding toward for 3 years before Cecilia arrived. He had been standing there long enough that his coffee had gone cold when she came and stood beside him. She looked out at what he was looking at, the barn and the yard and the loaded wagon that Tad was beginning to hitch the team to in the early light, his breath coming in small clouds in the cold air. "You should look behind you," she said. He turned. The kitchen window had always been bare. He had bought the blue gingham curtain fabric 2 years before Cecilia arrived, had left it folded on the shelf in its brown paper, had mentioned it to her on her first evening as evidence of intention. Through all the months since, the spring work and the summer gear and the railroad contract and the October storm and the 30 days and the morning Voss rode away, the fabric had waited on its shelf. But sometime in the past week, on a quiet Sunday, when the work was ahead of the schedule and the barn was still, she had made the curtains. They hung at the kitchen window and at the window in the front room beyond, and they were exactly what he had imagined when he had bought the fabric. Blue gingham, neat and even, the hems straight, the panels hanging true. They were pretty in the plain, honest way of something made well from good material by someone who knew what she was doing. He looked at them for a long moment without speaking. "You made them," he said. "One Sunday," she said. "The work was ahead and I had an afternoon." He stood looking at the curtains in the winter light, and he thought about the man who had stood on the depot platform in April with his hat in both hands, watching the train doors for someone who could make his cold cabin look like a home. He thought about the curtain fabric on the shelf for 2 years, the intention that had stood in for the thing itself, the way a man can want something so clearly that the wanting fills the space where the thing itself should be. The curtains were everything he had wanted them to be. They made the kitchen look like a home. They changed the quality of the light in the room, and they kept out the cold that had come through the bare frame all winter, and they were pretty to look at, just as he had imagined. But he found, standing there with his cold coffee in his hand, that they were not the measure of anything. Not anymore. The measure was in the sound that came from the barn, the steady pull of thread through canvas, the small percussion of the awl, the voices of women at work in the early morning. The measure was in the loaded wagon in the yard and the 6 women at the long tables and the ledger on the kitchen shelf with its 2 books and its columns that told the true story of what the ranch had become. The measure was in the receipt tucked between the October pages and the 4 torn pieces of a promissory note that had blown off the frozen ground of the yard and been carried by the November wind to wherever the wind carries the remains of things that no longer have any claim. The measure was a ranch sewn hole, one stubborn seam at a time. He looked at the curtains and then he looked at his wife, and Cecilia looked back at him with the same steady face she had shown him on the depot platform, when she had stepped off the train and put out her hand and said she wanted to see the place before she decided anything. He understood now that the seeing had never stopped, that she had been reading this place and everything in it, including him, with the same attention she brought to a torn canvas, finding where it would hold and where it needed work and what the soundcloth between the failures was capable of bearing. He had been part of that reading. He was not the same man she had found when she arrived, and the difference was not only what she had done to the ranch, it was what the doing had asked of him, and what he had finally, after some time and some cost, been willing to give. Outside, Tad called something to Orvin about the hitch, and Orvin answered in the brief, certain way he answered things now, and the team moved in the yard, and the barn lamps threw their yellow light across the frost, and the morning came fully on over the Sweetwater Valley, cold and clear and filled with the sound of people who had found their proper place in the work and were doing it well. Raymond set down his cold coffee and went out to help with the wagon.